Today in the bunker, we're going to make a wrecked industrial base suitable for Necromunda or any other post-apocalyptic gaming. Lately I found this piece of packing material, and I do not remember what came in it, but it's kind of a pressed paper fiber sort of thing. So I thought this might be a good bit to make into sort of a foundation for some large industrial equipment that's been removed. And this will be like a concrete base, and we'll add some little pieces to it. One of the things I started doing was I took a pin and made some holes. I took the hardware cloth, some of my offcuts of that, and cut it in such a way that it would push down in here. That's what the pin is for. Or you could use a drill bit or whatever to get that down in there. And try to do it straighter than I did. That's kind of crooked. But I'm going to glue those in place in various spots, and that'll look like sort of bolts that came up to hold the base of whatever was on here. And we're going to add some pieces of piping and maybe some access hatches and some of these Universal Greeblies, which is literally what they are. Look up the history of those if you're interested. But we'll add a bunch of little bits to it, and it'll be kind of a good place to put miniatures on. It'll block line of sight. You can make it a piece of impassable terrain, whatever. So let's get started. So we're going to take the pin and we'll figure out where we want our little bolt pieces. Some of these are almost too big, but you can take that and kind of push it down into the cardboard, and you'll see the little indents so you know where to put the hole. And then we'll take that and push it down in there, maybe. Okay, that's not quite as good as we might have hoped. And I keep hitting the camera. There we go. All right, so we're just going to use some PVA to hold those in place. I'll just lay down a bead. Hit the camera again. Seems to be a thing today. Okay, just kind of get the excess off. It won't be so critical on this because it's going to get, we're going to put some grout on here for a texture. I just want to make some of the underlying elements, put those in place first. So we're going to continue on adding those bits. Those are all added. One thing to note that I of course didn't pay attention to when I was putting them on is that the little bar that goes between them could be inside or outside. It may help to make that consistent, which I did not, but I don't know that it's going to take away from the overall look of the piece if you don't. In fact, it may add to it because it's the underhive and who knows. But we are going to get this ready to put texture on because the other pieces that I want to put on here, I'm going to add after the texture because I don't want them to have a concrete texture. So what we're going to do is cover this with PVA, and then we're going to take sandless tile grout and put that on there. Once it dries, we'll knock off the excess. I'm going to try to make it so it's not lumpy like the water pump building I did. This is a tremendous mess, so I'm going to do it outside, and I'll bring this back in once it's done, and then we'll continue to work on it. After the glue dried and I knocked off the excess, I'm not entirely convinced that that did much of anything. Maybe when I dry brush it. I started to prime it and then realized I needed to glue pieces on it. So let's set about gluing some bits on here and make this look a little better. It's got some pretty Well, it's not going to stay. Anyway, my grout game is pretty weak. I need to work on that. I think this is probably too rough for it. I should have just painted it as is, but that's fine. We'll make it work. So, let's see. I had a couple of spots. I took a piece of sprue and hit the camera again. I took a piece of sprue, and the ejector pins on one side are very handy for pushing into, if you make some little holes. There we go. You can glue those. It'll help to sort of guide that and hold it once you glue it down. And then we're going to glue some of these other pieces on. So I think I'm going to use some hot glue for that, just because it'll probably grip some of this stuff a little better than PVA. So let me get that set up and we'll get to gluing. Now that the glue gun's heated up, we'll get ready to put this piece of conduit on. Maybe where you could see it. We'll kind of press that down, sort of bolster that with a little bit of PVA and kind of get that to run down in there behind it. There we go. And you want to just kind of even that out a little bit, but that should help hold that on. And we'll put some other little greebly things on here. Just, you know, whatever you have laying around. I've got some old resin pieces that someone gave me a long time ago. I've got the Universal Greeblie, or Greeblies, that I 3D printed back when I first got my 3D printer. And if you look on Thingiverse, that's on there. If I can find the number, I'll put a link in the description. And let's see, maybe we'll put one of those here. And of course, there's no set way to do this, just whatever you think looks good. Just add it on there. So let's put a piece of, oops, I think I had that the other way. Yes, a piece of conduit in there. So normally I would try to, well, not stick it to my hand with glue, Mod Podge this because it's plastic. But because it's down in this and probably won't have a lot of abrasion on it, I'm just going to go ahead and prime it just with paint straight. It should be fine. Alright, so now we need to make a little junction box. So let me gather those bits. For the junction box, I'm just going to use a little offcut of foam core. And we'll just sort of hot glue that in place. And then we'll add some little pieces of mat board just to give it some interesting features. And you could do anything here. You can add these, all right, that sort of thing. Those sort of squares. And we'll kind of take our excess and move it off of there. Okay, and once that sets up a little bit, I could quit knocking them out of alignment. Once that sets up a little bit, I'm going to put some glue around the exposed foam core just to seal that before I spray paint it. And we may add a few more things, and then we'll get ready to prime it. Some other detailing I added was a bit of wire that I had, some hot glue and some PVA. I added some little buttons or lights. I guess they'll probably end up being lights on our junction box. And I'm going to let all this dry, and then we're going to go ahead and prime it. And I'm just going to use black spray paint to start. Last little bits I added, just took some drink carton and cut some strips, and then with super glue just added a couple of little clamps to hold the conduit in place. Just a little detail that kind of adds to it. So completely optional, but well worth doing, very easy to do. So, all right, we'll let this dry and get ready to prime. After priming, which I started with black and then did a bit of a zenithal highlight of gray, we can start to pick out some of the metal bits, and we'll paint up this concrete, which it almost looks more like carved rock, but that's fine. We'll work with it. Old pitted concrete is kind of the effect we're going for anyway, so shouldn't be a bad thing. So I'm going to start with kind of a rusty brown color, and we'll build up from there. So let me get that set up and we'll get started. Start with some nutmeg brown, but any kind of red brown works. We're also probably going to add some raw sienna to that, just to try and give it a little bit of a rusty appearance. For the conduit, I'm going to use a fairly small brush that may be okay. We just want to kind of pick out the details. Alright, so we'll do that to all the metal pieces, and we'll continue. After an initial coat of that brown color, we're going to let that dry a little bit, and we'll touch it up some more. In the meantime, I'm going to start sort of overbrushing this with some dark gray, and then we'll start building up from there. This is not really all that dark. It's a pewter gray. It's kind of a medium color. You can use about any color gray you really want, though. And we're just going to start trying to overbrush that on. And that'll kind of pick out the texture. I'm not sure. I guess it does show pretty good on camera. It's not really super concretey, but we'll run with it because it's what we got. So we will continue on. After we damp brush that on, that's already starting to get a little bit of contrast and look pretty good. I'm going to add some tan bits because concrete is rarely one color. So we're just going to try to kind of add some little tonal variations, I guess. And we're going to start that with, in this case I'm using country tan, but any tan you have will work. That's fine. Alright, so we will continue on with that. Now that we've added a little bit of tan to that, we're going to dry brush it with some very light gray, in this case Quaker gray, but as always, use whatever light gray you have. Don't get caught up on having to use exactly the same paints as I do. You're just going for the effect. So we're going to use a fairly large dry brush and see if we can't apply that. Alright, so that is just kind of hitting the very highest spots, so we'll continue on with that. After good dry brushing with the light gray, that really helped pick things out. I went back and picked out the mounting bits on the top with our brown color. We'll add a little more rust to that later, and just sort of freshened up all of the rusty color on the conduits and whatnot. So we're going to continue on with that. We're going to add a little color to these wires and kind of dress up. We'll probably dry brush the metal bits with some silver and add some color here or there as needed. So we will continue. And for our silver dry brush, we're just using some silver craft paint. Doesn't have to be anything fancy. And we're just going to add that to places like our junction box and the conduit. And neatness counts here. Try not to get it onto your concrete and or stone, whatever you want to consider that. And just very carefully kind of hit that. And that'll sort of help sell the fact that it's rusty metal. Alright, so we'll continue on. We added some little lights on there. I added a little bit of kind of peeling blue paint on that junction box. Added a light on each of these pieces. Put some color on these cables and put a little bit of copper color back on the, ironically enough, copper wire. Dry brushed all of the rusty metal stuff with silver. Kind of picked it out a little bit. And overall, it's not looking too bad. I think we're going to add maybe a little bit of staining, and be just about ready to call it good. So I've thinned out some black paint and added a little bit of magic wash to it. And now I'm just kind of going through and adding some drips to places where it looks like maybe some moisture or oil or whatever would accumulate and sort of drip down. And we'll even do it maybe where you can see it on camera. Alright, so we'll continue on around and do some more of that. So we've added some staining, basically kind of pooling moisture around where these mounts were, and then some drips. I also used that same stuff to kind of put some shading on some of the metal pieces. There's probably a few more that could use that. We'll just kind of add that in there to sort of give them a little more visual interest. And accentuate some shadows. And then we went back with the raw sienna and applied that here and there to the metal bits just to kind of highlight the rust. And there's no real right or wrong way to do that. It's just kind of to taste. So if you want it to be rustier or less rusty, that is certainly not a problem. So at this stage, I think this is pretty much about where I want it. We added staining on top, so I think we're going to call it good. Hopefully that was useful. You can take any kind of packaging like this, foam, compressed fiber, whatever, and do this same thing to it. The smoother it is, probably the better the grout texture will turn out. But this still didn't look too bad, I think. So, and if you wanted to make something like this that was like carved rock, you certainly could. It would certainly look the part. So hopefully that was helpful and maybe gave you guys some ideas. I appreciate you watching. Hope you guys have a fantastic day. After priming, I primed it black first and did a little bit of a zenithal highlight. Let me put my hands in there like a magician.